Thank you, Raj. And just for starters, I much prefer to be called Austin. Also, thank you to Lauren for inviting me to do this. I gave a version of this talk last November at Walla Walla University. So if you were present at that occasion, you will be hearing essentially the same ideas. I suspect that few of you would have been there, and if you were, at least you will have a chance to respond with your questions later on. We had some difficulty in getting the slides off my computer, so Lauren has graciously agreed to run them for me. So I appreciate that, Lauren. So we can move ahead. Let's start with definitions. What do we mean by mind? The APA Dictionary of Psychology renders the definition that you see on the screen broadly all intellectual and psychological phenomena of an organism encompassing motivational, affective, behavioral, perceptual, and cognitive systems. That is, the organized totality of an organism's mental and psychic processes and the structural and functional cognitive components on which they depend. Now, that's a mouthful. But hopefully we'll get simpler as we go on. Next slide. The substantive content of such mental and psychic processes, that's the sort of subsidiary definition. But specifically, I will focus on two of those processes, memory and decision-making. Now, in addition, the notion of mind tends to limit itself to an individual, which you see in this third definition, consciousness or awareness, particularly as specific to an individual. However, I will extend my discussion to look at the mind as well in a sort of social or communal sense. So, what do we mean to change minds? The most common meaning is discussed by Harvard University psychologist Howard Gardner in his 2004 book, Changing Minds. He presents it as follows. We have a mind set in one direction, some operation is performed, and lo and behold, the mind is now set in another direction. Gardner also limited his discussion of changing minds to cases that are significant, such as changes in political or ideological allegiance, religious convictions, or career goals. Secondly, such changes must be conscious. Gardner is limiting his discussion to decisions that the mind makes. According to this meaning, and following Gardner, I have changed my mind may mean that I had made a decision that is a reversal of a previously made decision, or I no longer hold the same belief about that thing that I previously held. Now, in both of these cases, it's assumed that the mind is a volitional process that is actively changed. Next slide. Alternatively, a person may say, my mind has been changed, meaning arguments or evidence have been presented that now make previous beliefs untenable. Here, there appears to be less of a volitional element, less agency. So there's an inevitability to the change. My mind has been forced into a new configuration by weight of evidence. It's still a conscious process, to be sure, but there seems to be something inexorable about the change. So we feel forced into it as if, and as we shall see, we resist these kinds of changes, probably to preserve agency or our sense of self. We want to feel that we change our minds ourselves, or we want to preserve our decisions or beliefs or perceptions. So there's a second way of thinking of changed minds. I'm sorry. Could you go back just one slide, please? Yeah. So we're looking at two ways of changing minds there. I have changed my mind, meaning I've reversed a previous decision or have changed my belief, and both of them, as I suggest, is volitional. Next slide. And then my mind has been changed, suggests that some evidence or some sort of external force has forced me to change my mind. Now, both of these are conscious, but one seems more volitional than the other. Another way of thinking about changing minds, however, and this is not captured by the definition I just suggested from Gardner, is thinking about mind in terms of the contents of our consciousness as our current perceptions of experience, what we refer to as our immediate memory or working memory, or stored or stored first-hand experiences, or stored account of our first-hand experiences. We refer to that as episodic or autobiographical memory. Next slide. We can summarize this notion of changing minds then as referring to conscious and deliberate change in a decision, a change in belief forced by weight of evidence, or a change in our apprehension of reality as recorded or constructed in our memory. Now, in this talk, I want to explore these varied aspects of changes of mind and make some applications to our current experience as persons of whatever country, although my examples might tend to be American ones, and as Adventists, though it might apply more broadly to other Christian denominations as well. Next slide. So what this talk is about then is, on one level, we'll explore the various ways in which people change their minds. On another level, I would suggest that we ask ourselves as a society, as a church, as individuals, about the ways in which we ought to change and how we might go about that change. In the process, we will use cases in memory and prophecy as a vehicle for our exploration. So let's begin with memory. Where were you when you first heard about Russian missiles in Cuba? Do you remember? If I am correct, most of the people in this group are of the age that you might remember that. If you're around my age, certainly you probably do. It was in the newspapers, on radio, on television, I'm sure. Now, I did not then live in the United States. I was a child still in elementary school, but I read the newspapers. And I remember seeing a map on the front page of the Trinidad Guardian newspaper. It's a map that I can still see in my mind's eye as I remember it. The map was of the Western Hemisphere, extending from the eastern seaboard of the United States down through the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago being the southernmost islands in the Caribbean. Now, at the center of the map was Cuba, and around it were a few concentric circles describing the areas that would be affected were there to be a nuclear attack on Cuba by the United States. Well, what got my attention and aroused some measure of anxiety was that Trinidad and Tobago was within the circle. Having seen the map on that day in October 1962, my mind was changed such that I can still see it. Now, if you're somewhat younger, you probably remember where you were when you heard that Martin Luther King had been killed, or Robert Kennedy, or any of the other terrible things that occurred in the summer of 1968. My most vivid memory of that summer was walking home from the public library in the town of Scarborough in Tobago, one late evening in July, if I'm not mistaken, and meeting a schoolmate named Andre, who told me the terrible news that Dave, our mutual classmate and my distant cousin, had just drowned on the nearby beach. Other memories. How about the January day in 1986 when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, killing all 8 astronauts aboard? Do you remember? Or if you are younger still, you might have vivid memories of 9/11. Or, coming to the age of most of my students, I've discovered that I can no longer use memorable events. Even 9/11 now is too long ago for my students. If you are the age of my students, you probably remember election night of 2008, or of course, January 6, 2021. Now, most of these are cases of communal memory, memories that millions share, but there are more personal memories, memories that are unique to you, memories like your first day of school, your first date, or your honeymoon night. In each of the cases I cited, your mind was changed by the event. That is, connections and networks in your brain were rewired to capture that new event such that it can be accessed later. So that, for example, I was able to access, and I'm sure you were able to, all of the events that I mentioned. And whether you alone experienced the event or you shared the event with one person or millions of people, each mind, in fact, each brain was changed in a unique way. Now, I have not had a conversation with my friend and classmate Andre about that fateful day in July in 1968, nor did I go back to the archives of the Trinidad Guardian to confirm the accuracy of the map that I saw in 1962, or at least I did not until I first wrote about the event. And then I did a search on Google. And next slide, I found this map. Now, is this the map that I saw? Probably, or maybe one similar to it. What I do know, and what memory researchers have demonstrated, is that I may have remembered those events rather differently than the way they happened. In other words, I might have developed a false memory, and you might as well. Not only was my mind changed when I experienced those events, but more importantly, it may have changed further in a number of ways. And so I want to give you a sample of some of that, the evidence that suggests that. But first, back in 1932, Sir Frederick Bartlett of Cambridge University in England published his major work on remembering. And he proposed that when we experience an event, we organize the information regarding those experiences into a network of abstract structures. He called those structures schemas. Bartlett's pioneering work laid the foundation for later work built on the insight that memory is not something permanently laid down in the brain, like a video image or a track on a recording tape. Rather, memory is constantly morphing. It's a constantly morphing configuration of connected networks. It's dependent on prior experience to determine its initial form, but it's reconstructed each time a recollection is attempted. Each new recollection is dependent on intervening experiences. To put it more simply, when you experience an event, your mind changes in that new schemas are formed. We may call that a memory. The remarkable thing to note is that the form that memory takes is dependent on your earlier experiences of related events and even your expectations of what that event ought to be. Further, that memory is not static. It will change as you hear others talk about that event or see news items about that event. When you attempt to retrieve the account of the event from memory, your reconstruction of the memory will be influenced by the current conditions. It will be influenced by the expectations others have. It will be influenced by your beliefs about what should have occurred, and even the way the question was posed. The result is that what you remember would likely not be an identical account of the event, though it usually includes the gist or kernel of truth, but it exists as a kernel with parts that may be entirely false. There's a procedure that's referred to as the DRM procedure. It was first proposed by James Deese and later built up and extended on by Henry Roediger and Kathleen McDermott. And it's one in which they present lists of 15 related words to participants with one critical word missing. An example of such a list is on the next slide. This slide includes the words butter, food, eat, sandwich, rye, jam, milk, flour, jelly, dough, crust, slice, wine, loaf, toast. It turns out that there's a critical word that's not in that list. And the researchers found that more than half the time, the participants falsely recalled that critical word, even though it was not presented. You may want to guess what that critical word was. The critical word was bread. There are a number of other lists that are part of that procedure, and we won't look at them all, but in each case, what McDermott and others found, Roediger, McDermott and others found, was that a large proportion of individuals reported having seen a word that was not there. The mind had constructed a memory of an event that never happened. Not yet, we'll get to that next slide in a little bit. So what seems clear is that the mind, our minds, store and retrieve information that's not necessarily identical to our experiences, but that fit some general schema that's derived from those experiences. I remember when I first encountered this idea some years ago at a conference, soon after the Roediger paper was published. I was at a conference, a number of other psychologists were present, and the presenter, Professor Jim Nairn from Purdue University, sort of did the experiment with that group. We were all psychologists, and he warned us beforehand of what we were likely to do. And then he presented this list. And notwithstanding the fact that we were warned, many of us, and frankly, I don't remember whether I was one of those, but about a third of the group still remembered the word that was not there. You would think that highly emotional events would be remembered more accurately. Let me take you back once more to 9/11. I think that let's go to the next slide, please. 9/11. Now, suppose you are president of the United States and the country is attacked. You would remember every detail of that day, wouldn't you? So let me share with you what Duke University psychologist Daniel Greenberg reported in a 2004 article. On 3 occasions following the events of 9/11, President Bush was asked about his recollections of the time he first heard the news of the attack. So I'll give you Mr. Bush's answers as Greenberg reported it. 2 of these were verbatim reports. Another he derived from a newspaper reporter's account. So the first verbatim report was in answer to a young boy named Jordan, who asked Mr. Bush at a town hall meeting in December 2001, so that's about 3 months following 9/11, 3 months following 9/11. He asked him, what did he remember about the event? Next slide. So this is Mr. Bush's answer. Well, Jordan, you're not going to believe what state I was in when I heard about the terrorist attack. I was in Florida, and my chief of staff, Andy Card, actually, I was in a classroom talking about a reading program that works. And I was sitting outside the classroom waiting to go in, and I saw an airplane hit the tower. The TV was obviously on, and I used to fly myself. And I said, there's one terrible pilot. And I said, it must have been a horrible accident. But I was whisked off there, and I didn't have much time to think about it. And I was sitting in the classroom, and Andy Card, my chief, who was sitting over here, walked in and said, a second plane has hit the tower. America, it's under attack. Now, the second response came about 2 weeks later, December 20, 2001. Next slide. This was Mr. Bush speaking to a reporter for a news story. And here's the account as the reporter related it. Bush remembers senior advisor Karl Rove bringing him the news, saying it appeared to be an accident involving a small twin-engine plane. In fact, it was American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 out of Boston Logan International Airport. Based on what he was told, Bush assumed it was an accident. This is pilot error, the president recalled saying. It's unbelievable that somebody would do this. Conferring with Andrew H. Card Jr., his White House chief of staff, Bush said, the guy must have had a heart attack. At 9:05 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175, also a Boeing 767, smashed into the south tower of the Trade Center. Bush was seated on a stool in the classroom when Card whispered the news. A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. Now, another 2 weeks later, January 5, 2005, the president is again in a town hall meeting, and he's again asked his recollection. And here is his verbatim account, the verbatim account of his response. I was sitting there, and my chief of staff, first of all, when we walked into the classroom, I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on. And I thought it was pilot error, and I was amazed that anybody could make such a terrible mistake. And something was wrong with the plane. Anyway, I'm sitting there listening to the briefing, and Andy Card came and said, America is under attack. Now, three rather similar accounts in many ways, but with some clear discrepancies, especially between the second account and the first and third accounts, which were quite similar. Now, did Mr. Rove bring him the news, as the second account says, or did he see the first plane hit the tower, as he claimed in the first and third accounts? Well, what we do know is that he could not have seen on TV the first tower hit, because no one did. It was not broadcast live. But he must have seen footage as news media repeatedly broadcasted in the intervening 3 months before his December 4 response to Jordan. And somehow these were inserted into his memory, changing his mind, if you will. And now he claims it as his memory. Now, let me emphasize here that I'm not dealing with a person with a faulty memory, nor are we dealing with a liar. What this and what I will say next would alert us to is that we are on thin ice when we are likely, let me say that again. We're on thin ice when we accuse someone of lies. These small discrepancies indicate, and sometimes the discrepancies are even smaller, is that our memories are dynamic, change, and sometimes we believe things to be true that turn out not to be the case. You may consider, having conversations with close friends or or siblings or whatever about an event that all of you witnessed, but you can't get the story straight. Everyone remembers it in somewhat different ways. Now, in this case, the discrepancies are small, but they matter. Even if we get the gist right, the discrepancies matter. In fact, they would matter if you were in a court of law and a defendant's life depended on it. Now, probably the most prolific researcher regarding the vagaries of memory is Elizabeth Loftus, who formerly was at University of Washington, now at UC Irvine. And a series of studies beginning in the mid-1970s, she and her collaborators have shown that our memories of our experiences can be fragile at times and that we can remember things that never happened. And she particularly looks at eyewitness accounts, and especially, in fact, eyewitness accounts as told in courtroom testimony. A sobering fact about false memory is that how certain you are about a memory bears no relation to its accuracy. There are real implications, of course, for faulty eyewitness testimony, as the Innocence Project and Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative have demonstrated. The work of Loftus and other memory researchers is not just textbook stuff. According to Prison Fellowship, since 1989, the United States has used DNA testing to exonerate 225 innocent people after they've spent years in captivity. And according to the Death Row Information Center, since 1973, at least 186 people who have been wrongly convicted and sentenced to death in the United States have been exonerated. Many of these were convicted by faulty eyewitness testimony. The number of innocent persons these cases, whose cases have not been discovered in time before they were executed is, of course, unknown. So it might be time for our society, a society that claims that all lives matter, to change its mind about an irrevocable penalty that continues to kill innocent people. Yet, if memory shows us that changing minds can be easy and sometimes imperceptible, our response to failed expectation, as in prophecy, can show us how changing minds can be hard. Now, let's turn to prophecy. If memory is a personal record of experience in the past, prophecy is a projection into the future. In prophecy also, minds can change, though not in the same way. And when prophecy fails or appears to fail, changing minds can be hard. We as Adventists know well the story of the Millerites, culminating in what came to be called the Great Disappointment. On the morning of October 23, 1844, the believers were left with a conundrum. Two opposite ideas cannot live well in the same mind. The prophecy cannot be true and not true at the same time. If the prophecy is true, these believers couldn't still be on earth. And if the prophecy was false, it meant that they had been deluded. Such cognitive conflict is untenable. So they were left with two options: either abandon belief altogether and so admit that the prophecy was not true, or change the meaning of the event that was prophesied. In the end, tens of thousands took the first option and abandoned belief. But a smaller number, following the creative reinterpretation suggested by Hiram Edson, changed the meaning of the prophecy, and thus was born the sanctuary doctrine. Social psychologist Leon Festinger had examined the historical record and was intrigued by this and a number of other similar narratives. He had looked at earlier prophetic movements, including the Anabaptists, who predicted the beginning of the millennium in 1533, and the Jewish seer Sabbatai Zevi, who predicted the coming of the Messiah in 1648 and again in 1666. And he began to develop a theory to explain what happens to followers when prophetic movements fail. Fessinger formulated the hypothesis that when a prophecy is subject to disconfirmation, that is, when a prophecy fails, there arises a disconnect between belief and reality, what he termed cognitive dissonance. Next slide. There would naturally be a high motivation to reduce this dissonance. Cognitive dissonance we can define as our attempt to avoid having conflicting beliefs and attitudes because it makes us feel uncomfortable. We want to avoid that discomfort, this dissonance. One way of doing so would be to abandon belief in face of evidence, right, the disconfirmation. But what if this belief was bought at a high price? What if holding on to the belief came at the expense of family or job or great personal or economic loss, or just, well, one's face, saving face? The balance may now swing to the other side, not to change your mind, but to change the facts, or at least the meaning of the facts. So in 1954, Fessinger and his colleagues at the University of Minnesota found the perfect opportunity to test his theory. They describe what happened next in their 1956 book, When Prophecy Fails. Next slide. A Chicago woman named Dorothy Martin had received what she claimed to be supernatural messages that in the coming months there would be a cataclysmic earthquake resulting in a flood that would destroy large sections of North and South America. A group of believers gathered around her, including a Michigan doctor who became a major recruiter and the leader of the group. But this was not a mere prophecy of doom. Salvation was promised to believers in the form of a flying saucer that would arrive before dawn on December 21 to take believers to another planet and to safety. Fessinger and his colleagues at the University of Minnesota contrived to infiltrate this group of believers to study this process from the inside. So since we are still here on the western side of the continent and on this planet, no less, we know that Mrs. Martin's prophecy failed when the flying saucer did not arrive on December 21 as expected. That was explained by the leaders, a minor delay, but the scheduled arrivals continually failed to occur. And explanation after explanation became less tenable. It eventually became clear that it would not happen. So how did the believers respond? As you might expect, the leaders were the ones who had expended the most. They continued to believe after the disconfirmation. All the believers experienced extreme emotional upset at the repeated failure of the flying saucer to arrive. Those believers who had fostered doubts or were skeptical of the prophecy quickly left the group. But many believers remained. Some may have had initial doubts, but these were removed by the leaders' rationalizations. Those who were isolated from the central group suffered the greatest disillusionment. But many had expended much to remain believers. Some had left their jobs, others had left their studies, many had sacrificed relationships. For many of these, conviction increased after this confirmation. As Fessinger and his colleagues predicted, they dealt with their cognitive dissonance by holding on even more strongly to their belief. Now, I've mentioned evidence from the 16th century and the 17th century, the Millerites in the 19th century, the believers in the 20th century. And there are also more recent examples, even in the 21st century, of Mr. Harold Camping of Family Radio, who predicted that the world would end in 1988, and then in 1994, and then on May 21, 2011. And finally, October 21, 2011. Each time the prophecy failed, each time the failure was explained as a mere miscalculation with greater confidence that the new date was going to be correct. And each time, there were thousands of his radio followers who believed. Camping finally repented after the last failure and gave up his predictions before his passing in 2013. In 2015, a young charismatic preacher named Jeremiah Johnson prophesied that Donald Trump will be elected to the presidency. Other prophets followed with concurring predictions. The number increased as Mr. Trump rose in the polls. Misgivings about his personal life gave way, and the biblical model of King Cyrus was invoked as a type to match the 20th century antitype. The prophecy was disseminated first by Charisma magazine and through various forms of social media, notably YouTube. Considering that the original prophecy came at a time when Mr. Trump was seen as a rank outsider by most informed insiders, and before he had risen to be a contender in the polls, his eventual surprise election in 2016 would have been seen as a significant verification of prophetic authenticity. And so, considering that many prophets had already predicted not one, but 2 terms for the president, it would not have been surprising that even more prophets joined the fray in 2020. Throughout the world of charismatic Christianity, prophets were proclaiming the re-election of the president. It was easier to reject the polls this time. They were wrong in 2016. Why wouldn't they be wrong again? And when the early returns on the evening of November 3 raised hopes, the celebrations began. Surely God had ordained this leader to lead America to greatness. But in the days following November 4, it became increasingly clear that prophecies were failing. What do you do when prophecy fails? Well, Fessinger had hypothesized back in 1954 that when belief did not match reality, cognitive dissonance would increase, resulting in a high motivation to reduce that dissonance by either changing belief to match the facts or changing the facts to be more consonant with the belief. But changing minds can be difficult. And when one has expended a great deal of one's personal capital, the prophecy must remain true, even if the facts on the ground appear to say otherwise, because it's hard to change your mind. The alternative is to change the facts. And one's interpretation of the facts. And so for the whole period between November 4 and January 20, next slide, the prophets doubled down. Daily YouTube reports were put up by prophets such as Kat Kerr, next slide, Hank, Kahneman, Sid Roth, Dutch Sheets. These have continued in the months following the inauguration. The prophets insisted that somehow the rulings of courts and the results of recounts and audits notwithstanding, Mr. Trump would be declared president by January 6, or sometime before the inauguration on January 20. Even after the inauguration, some insisted that all would be set right by March 4 or August 13. When I first presented this talk in November, I had just seen October 22 broadcast on YouTube, in which a channel that boasts hundreds of thousands of subscribers, one such prophet said, quote, "Joe Biden is not the president of the United States." For those prophets and their many followers, changing belief was much more costly, in fact, too costly for their sense of self and for their faith. In order to resolve the cognitive dissonance and restore equilibrium, the only alternative was to change the facts. And for them, Mr. Trump must still be president. Let me emphasize here that cognitive dissonance is not a mental disorder. Dissonance is not dysfunction. It's a perfectly normal way in which humans seek to preserve equilibrium. The resolution of dissonance is not necessarily an error in thinking. Next slide. Sometimes, however, it can have negative effects, such as rejecting new information. One way that works is called confirmation bias, where our underlying tendency is to notice or focus on and give greater credence to evidence that fits with our existing beliefs. And we do it all the time if we aren't careful. So I will make no judgment about whether our religious ancestors arrived at a correct interpretation when they reinterpreted Miller's interpretation of the 2300-day prophecy. That must be left to theological analysis, and I'm not a theologian. But that analysis cannot ignore the cognitive process that may have led to that reinterpretation. Some time ago, I began to inquire into the question, how do people experience significant changes of mind? My concern was not so much the causes or correlations. I wanted to understand from a more phenomenological perspective what people experience as they journey through a change in their belief system. So I attempted to answer that question using a qualitative approach. I interviewed 11 participants who had indicated they had experienced such a change, exploring with them at some depth their own experience as they went through that significant change of mind. Before I proceed in telling you what I found, it would be appropriate for me to provide a few caveats. This was a modest study without a huge sample size, and it did not use statistical methodology, so we won't make wide generalizations. However, it gave a window into the experiences of these individuals, and it provided some understanding of what people in similar settings might go through. It also may provide the groundwork for further exploration. So what did these persons' experiences show? I identified 3 phases. Next slide. I identified 3 phases in this study, which I entitled, it's published in the qualitative report, and it's entitled, I Don't See It That Way Anymore, a qualitative study of significant changes of mind. These people seemed to go through at least 3 phases. What I call the pre-change phase, the change phase, that is what the person's experience is as the change is occurring, and the post-change phase, what happens after the change has occurred. Now, before the change occurs, an individual is in a state of comfort, or what one might call emotional quiescence. The person is comfortable about their religious or psychological stance, but this quiescence ends with a precipitating event. An event occurs that upsets the prevailing equilibrium, an event that raises questions about one's status quo. It might be a failed prophecy. It might be some other experience that causes one to question one's worldview. This can be a massive life-changing event that overcomes all defenses. More likely, it can be a relatively small event, a culmination to a series of lesser events that threaten the prevailing worldview but did not by themselves overthrow it. So like the final blow of a sledgehammer that breaches a wall previously impregnable. It was impregnable to single blows, but successive blows eventually breaks the defenses. This event finally breaches the defense of confirmation bias and puts the individual into a state of disequilibrium. Examples of such an event might include a scientific study that challenges one's accepted dogma, or an irrevocable break in a relationship, or disconfirmation of prophecy, as I suggested earlier. These and other precipitating events mark the end of the pre-change phase and herald the change phase. Now, this change might be fast, occurring over a short period of time, or it might be slow, extending over a period of months or years. The change may be gradual. Sorry about that. Or it may be punctuated by bursts of insight. As the process of change proceeds, there may be anxiety or unease. The person is off balance. Piaget used the term disequilibrium, and that might be applied here. The person undergoing a major change in worldview is likely confronted with existential questions about their place in the world. They may be faced with practical decisions about career and personal relationships. As time passes in this phase, there may be vacillation. Am I on the right course? Is my logic faulty? Have I lost my faith? Am I even sane? In some, this phase is characterized by emotional turmoil and decision-making. Finally, a mental Rubicon, as it were, is crossed, and the person finds themselves in the post-change phase. As I suggested earlier, this may not be sudden, but there may not be a well-defined end to the process, but still an increased emotional comfort resumes. One of the participants that I interviewed described it as a sense of peace. And yet, consistent with our change of our theme of change and perseverance, it appears that the break from the past is often not complete. Even in the face of radical change, there are enduring connections to past events, past patterns of behavior. Of the individuals in my study whose worldview changed, the change was related to religious belief. All continue to identify with their religious community, even in the face of significant deviation from previously held religious tenets. So I've talked largely about individual change. I want briefly to talk now about societal changes of mind, or group change, if you will. Like individuals, societies or societal groups from time to time undergo major changes in their consensus regarding accepted beliefs. Americans did not always agree that republicanism was preferable to monarchy, nor did Americans always generally agree that people with dark skin from Africa or Asia were social and intellectual equals with people who originated in Europe. Not even Abraham Lincoln believed that. Post-1844 Adventists did not always agree that the Sabbath on Saturday was an important religious discipline, or that giving attention to our physical health had merit. Like individuals, societies and large social groups are resistant to change. Like individuals, societies undergo significant upheaval on the path to change. Our recent dramatic example, or at least one recent dramatic example of how a society can change its mind, is highlighted by a study by Stanford University sociologist Michael Rosenfeld, published in 2017. After examining survey data covering the past 50 years, Rosenfeld concluded that no measured public opinion attitude in the United States has changed more and more quickly than same-sex marriage. To illustrate that dramatic change, I want to show you two charts. Next slide. Now, the first chart compares societal attitude trends regarding abortion on the left and those regarding approval of gay rights on the right. Notice how level the lines on the left are, and note the dramatic upward trend on the right. The lines represent specific questions having to do with abortion rights. You probably can't see it very well on your screen, it's pretty small. You should see the lines, but the individual questions you might not see very clearly. But they represent questions about whether you would allow a gay speaker or a gay author's book or approve of a gay teacher. There's moderate increase in each of those attitudes over the years. But now pay attention to the bottom three lines. Those questions have to do with whether one approves of sex between two gay people and whether one approves of gay marriage. Note the steep rise on the curve, especially around 2005 or so. The question is, what causes such dramatic societal change? The first thing to say is that a social change such as this might be a result of an accumulation of individual changes of mind that have reached some critical mass. But second, we might point to some unique and powerful processes that occur when people operate in groups. One such process that Rosenfeld identified is the effect of leaders on this process. In this case, public embrace of LGBT plus community by popular political leaders. Rosenfeld referred to President Clinton. Now, his later embrace of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the Defense of Marriage Act has made him less of a hero in the LGBT plus community. But Rosenfeld argues that his influence on the society's attitude was still lasting and significant. Now, the second effect of gays and lesbians coming out of the closet, the second effect is the effect of gays and lesbians coming out of the closet. For the first time, Rosenfeld says, people discovered that they had friends and acquaintances, even family members who were gay or lesbian. They could now identify with them and their attitudes changed. Whatever your views on this issue, the point ought not to be lost. Identifying with members of a disfavored group, working side by side with them, realizing that they are part of your family can change your mind about them. Society or segments of a society such as a church tends to change slowly, but there are times when society needs to change rapidly. And we can learn from this case something about how society or our church, or indeed any particular group, can change. Now, not all change is desirable. Some change represents drift along with the wider society that might be counter to our values. But when that current goes in the right direction, as it sometimes does, we must not resist it. Our society has been slow to change on a number of matters. On matters of race, for example, we have slumbered along under the illusion that we have moved a long way, and in some ways we have. But if 2008 lulled us into complacency, the election of a Black president, more recent events should wake us up. There is much change to occur on this front if our nation is to be healed. Also, our nation must, as I hinted earlier, change its mind about the death penalty. One must wonder whether we have been slow because the victims of unjust execution are so often those people, not your aunt or uncle or sister or brother or best friend. So there are a number of ways in which we need to change as a country, and I suggest some of them here. One I want to mention specifically, our world is undergoing a crisis that we have been slow to recognize as seas begin to rise due to the warming of our planet. Now, this is not a future event. Our complacency here in the continental US does not match the urgency that's experienced by people in islands of the Maldives, for instance, or in other parts of or in the Pacific. I've sort of lost my place, just a minute. Just last week, I was listening to the Prime Minister of Barbados talk about the fact that their water system, which is largely from wells, are under threat because of the encroachment of seawater. The Maldives and the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, these people are seeing their living space disappear under the rising waters. We must change our minds about how we care about our planet. And it may be that because we aren't directly being affected, it is not our brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts who are affected, that we're not as ready to think about change. But we must change our minds about how we care about our planet and people who live in vulnerable parts of it. Next slide. Our church has been slow to change on a number of matters of equality in ministry, or attitudes on gender, and so on. We should not ignore the important role that leaders must take at all levels to catalyze this kind of change. Now, prophecy has often been thought of as predicting or foretelling the future. And this is the sense in which I've used it this morning or this afternoon for some of you. In the cases that I cited, the record of prophets have been not so stellar. we really aren't good at predicting the future, and we don't have a good record of interpreting prophecy. I would like to suggest another sense in which the word may be used, also consistent with biblical prophets, and that is one who casts a vision of a better future and calls on people to live up to that vision. May I suggest that what we need as a denomination, as individuals even, as a nation, is prophets of that sort who can cast a vision of a better future, calling on us to change our minds on race, on gender, on criminal justice, on caring for our planet, on caring for the least of these. First, for those who are closest to us, next slide, but to the uttermost parts of the world as well.